Good evening. Welcome. Very happy to see at the start of term a room full of people eager to hear interesting things, which is exactly what we're going to hear tonight. I'm Andres Velasco. I am the Dean of School of Public Policy at the LSE. Those of you who are SPP people, we have met. Those of you who are not, delighted to have you here. Welcome to the School of Public Policy event. One always begins these introductions by saying we are very privileged to have, and often one does not mean that, but tonight I am going to say we are very privileged to have, and I actually mean that, because we have a great speaker who also happens to be a dear friend. Michael Reid has worn several hats, one of which was as the man who wrote the Bello column in The Economist for a long time and who was the senior editor at The Economist for Latin America. So when I was a minister in Chile, he used to come and interview me and ask difficult probing questions, which I will confess now made me a little nervous at the time. I did my best not to let it show, but I can tell you what a good interviewer and good journalist he was. Michael is also the author of lots of books on the region, and given that I am over 60 years old, I will forget the exact title, so I'm going to read them. The Forgotten Continent, A History of the New Latin America. I'd be curious to what the new Latin America is. Yale University Press, 2017. Brazil, The Troubled Rise of a Global Power. Yale University Press, 2014. And Spain, The Trials and Triumphs of a Modern European Country, also by Yale, recently published in 2023. So Michael is a journalist, a reporter, a columnist, an author, and somebody who knows the region very, very well. So the rules of engagement are very simple. We're going to give Mike the podium. Would you like to speak from here, from there? Yes, I think that's the right way to do it. Given that this is a Latin American event, I am going to set no time limit on him. That would be very much at variance with the culture of the region. But he's English, so he won't go on for very long. After that, I will take my chair's privilege and ask him 2 or 3 questions of the same kind of scary question that he used to ask me. And then we will open it for a dialogue. And we have 90 minutes, so no rush, plenty of time for a good discussion. So the title of Michael's lecture tonight is Latin America's Labyrinth, Economic Stagnation, Populism, and the Weakening of the Democratic Center. Without further ado, Michael Reid, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Andres, for that kind introduction. Thank you, above all, for kindly inviting me to be a visiting professor in practice at the School of Public Policy.
But he said it.
And for me, it is a privilege to be associated with the LSE, which for more than 125 years has been played an important role in social progress in this country and has formed lots of Latin American leaders. I won't wholly blame LSE for Latin America's problems, but since I'm sure that the people it has formed have been part of the solution. Thank you to all of you for coming, firstly. Thank you to those of you who are joining online. It's great to see so many people here. I first travelled to Latin America in 1980, and I moved to live there in 1982. And in total, I've lived there for almost 20 years since then, in addition to frequent visits, with long periods in this country and then in Spain as well. So what follows are some reflections on what has changed over those 40 more years and on the state of the region today. And looking back, one is reminded of an old Brazilian joke that Brazil is the land of the future, as Stefan Zweig, a famous Austrian author of the first half of the 20th century, wrote in the title of a book. And popular humour in Brazil immediately added, and always will be. It's a bit like that with Latin America as a whole. The potential is so evident, and so are the obstacles and frustration. Always, when talking about Latin America, you have to be careful about generalization, because Chile and Uruguay, for example, are not the same as Guatemala or Venezuela. Between them, Brazil and Mexico account for slightly more than half of Latin America's total population of 666 million, and almost 60% of its GDP. But of course, there are lots of much smaller countries as well. One always has to be careful about generalizing, but one always does generalize, because you can't live without doing so. In many ways, Latin America has changed dramatically since 1980. Then dictators were starting to depart and democracies to arrive. And by 1989, all but Cuba and Mexico were democracies, and Mexico would be by 2000, as part of what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democracy in the world, of which Latin America was a big protagonist. A second transition was happening in parallel, which began a bit earlier, which was of economic policy, from statism and protectionism to broadly free market policies and broadly open economies, often known as the Washington Consensus. There was much more variation in the details of those new economic policies than is often recognized, and there has been some retreat from openness, particularly in some countries since then. A third change is in the international context. Although the notion that Latin America was always under the thumb of the United States is an exaggeration, certainly it was part of a US zone of influence, and Europe and Japan were influential too. Now, of course, it's the site of great power rivalry, with China having an important footprint. And that's a development of uncertain implications, I think, over the next few years and decades. 40 years on, Latin American societies have changed a lot as well. They're now highly urbanized and less hierarchical than they were. There have been important advances in education and health. Now, 2/3 of all young Latin Americans complete secondary school, up from around 40% in 2000. And over 50% are now in some sort of higher or further education, up from 23% in 2000. Though, of course, pandemic school closures dealt a heavy blow in the region and will be a factor that will increase inequality in the coming years, and quality is poor on the whole. Latin Americans are, in income terms, less poor than they were. Income inequality remains among the highest in the world, but it has come down a bit. And racial and gender inequality, while still marked, are much more contested than they used to be. If one thinks back 15 years or so, when South America in particular was surfing the great commodity boom, there was a lot of optimism in the region. Growth had picked up, and democracies seemed to have put down roots with regular alternations in power and a degree of political stability. But that optimism masked a chilling reality, that since the 1970s, Latin America has failed to converge in income terms with the rest of the world. Not only has no Latin American country made the leap to developed status, but in comparative terms, the region is falling behind. In the early 1970s, income per head in Brazil and Mexico was higher than in South Korea. Now, South Korea is 3 times richer than both of those countries. Argentina is, of course, in a class by itself when it comes to decline. True, development in general is difficult, but Latin America has not been very successful at it in the past half-century. The years since the ending of the commodity boom in around 2013 have been tough and turbulent for Latin America. The past 10 years have been another lost decade for the region, with GDP expanding since 2014 at an annual average rate of just 0.8% per head, which is roughly the rate of population growth in the region. So income per head has failed to grow. Politically, democracy is now under strain in many countries. Political scientists used to imagine that the consolidation of democracy was a one-way street, but reality has disabused them. There are now 3 dictatorships in Latin America, in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The first 2 are failed economies, and all 3 have seen a large exodus of people over the past few years. El Salvador is close to becoming an elected dictatorship. Nayib Bukele, its young president since 2019, is hugely popular because of his draconian crackdown on crime, which has involved jailing tens of thousands of young men without trial. He controls the judiciary and the legislature and is poised to run for a second term next year, although the Constitution bars this, and he's almost certain to be re-elected. Secondly, in many countries, democracy is decaying. There have been several manifestations of that decay. They include a resurgence of populisms, outbreaks of mass street protests, sometimes dubbed social explosions, anti-incumbency, and political polarizations and fragmentation, which have made government harder. Some of these manifestations of discontent are, of course, global, but they are particularly acute in Latin America, and I will return to them in more detail in a moment. But by way of introduction, consider some of the events of this year in Latin America, which suggest a move towards the extremes and democratic stress. In January, in Brasilia, thousands of supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, the defeated president, invaded the Congress buildings, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace in Brasilia and trashed them in a failed attempt to provoke a military coup inspired by the January 6 riot in Washington. In the same month, often violent protests raged in Peru following the impeachment and imprisonment of Pedro Castillo, a narrowly elected president of the far left who had announced a self-coup against Congress. 49 people were killed in the repression of the protests, and 11 died because of protester roadblocks. In May, Ecuador's president, Guillermo Lasso, facing impeachment on specious grounds by a hostile parliament, used his constitutional power to call fresh elections. Amid a crime wave that has seen hundreds die in prison battles, a presidential candidate was shot dead, apparently on the orders of a gang boss, as he was leaving a campaign rally. In Chile, following the overwhelming rejection in a plebiscite last October of a draft new constitution written by a convention dominated by the hard left, the hard right has achieved a dominant position in a new constituent council elected in May. But the signs are that the electorate may reject this second new text. Chileans seem to be in a rejectionist move. Thank you very much. In Argentina, a simultaneous primary election in August, the most votes were cast for Javier Milei, a far-right libertarian who, like Bolsonaro, is a fan of Donald Trump, and he seems best placed to win the presidential election, whose first round is on October the 22nd. In Guatemala, Bernardo Arévalo, a Democrat of the center-left who campaigned against corruption, unexpectedly won a presidential election in August. But in a clear abuse of her powers, the prosecutor general appointed by a previous right-wing president is now attempting to block Arévalo's accession to office. So what has gone wrong in Latin America? Let me start with what I think has not gone wrong. The post-Washington consensus macroeconomic framework has delivered stability and a certain resilience, leaving aside Argentina and Venezuela, which both abandoned that framework. In the main, economies in the region achieved a swift macroeconomic recovery after the pandemic. Most governments were able to extend emergency aid during the pandemic, not as much as in Europe and the US, but considerably more than in the past. in Latin America. Growth last year and this at 4% and probably close to 3% this year, although the World Bank just said 2%, but the World Bank is often involved on these things. It may not be on other things. And that is not bad in comparative terms, though it probably won't last beyond this year. Independent central banks are doing their jobs. When inflation struck in 2021, they were quick to raise their interest rates, rather quicker than in Europe or the US. And inflation is coming down, and they're starting to cut them, which is how it should work. Argentina and Ecuador aside, there's been no debt crisis, and financial systems seem robust. Touch plastic wood. Rather, it is three other things that seem to have gone wrong. The first is microeconomics. Leaving aside the pandemic recovery, there is a chronic lack of economic growth in the region, as I have noted, and there is little sign of that changing in the medium term. Why? Because the underlying reason is Latin America's woeful productivity performance. Latin American workers are only 24% as productive as their counterparts in the US, and that is down from 27% in 1990. In that period, workers in both Eastern Europe and many Asian countries have become comparatively more productive. So why are Latin American workers and firms so unproductive? There's a lot of reasons. They include the fact that 1 Latin American in 2 works in the informal economy and has done for years, where productivity is low. But even formal firms can be relatively unproductive because of lack of competition, poor worker training, insufficient export experience, poor management by international standards, and poor infrastructure outside the factory gates. Overregulation and the dysfunctionality of Latin America's megacities contribute to informality. Many workers face a 2-hour commute, both morning and evening, in overcrowded public transport. Lack of childcare or cultural resistance to using it means that many women prefer to invent work at home rather than cross the city to a formal job. A few years ago, I visited a young woman in a low-income suburb of Lima who dreamed of studying computer science, but she worked in a subsistence business in the home with her father, making socks on a machine that was more than 100 years old. In Nezahualcóyotl, a vast low-income settlement on the edge of Mexico City, a few years ago, I talked to a group of small business owners, all informal, all suffering extortion, regular extortion by criminal gangs, which of course deterred them from expanding or going formal. In other words, a big factor behind poor productivity is the lack of public goods. Security, transport, effective regulation, for example. That is one phase of the second big problem, weak states, sometimes captured by private interests, incapable of enforcing the rule of law. That weakness is rooted in history and geography. Faced with governing vast territories of mountains, forests, and deserts, both the Spanish and Portuguese colonists and later the founders of the independent republics resorted to cutting deals with local potentates rather than imposing a national framework of law. Chile was an exception, partly because although it has big deserts and lots of fjords, the important part is pretty compact and rather European in climate. Another phase of the weakness of the state and the lack of the rule of law is, of course, the power of organized crime in the region, which is both consequence and cause of the weakness of the rule of law. There is a chilling and oft-cited statistic that sums this up. Latin America accounts for around 8.4% of the world's population, 7.4% of the world economy, and around 30% of the world's murders. In this century, organized crime associated with the drug trade has spread its tentacles from the northern Andes right across the region and is increasingly penetrating politics. As a result, security ranks with the economy as the top public concern in the region in opinion polls, and it currently outranks the economy in some countries. Economic stagnation, or in some places the slowdown of growth, has narrowed opportunities for Latin Americans, especially younger ones, whom, as we have seen, have more years of education than their parents, and in many cases have invested their families' money in obtaining that education. And that lack of opportunity, which they thought they were going to get, makes Latin America's multi-dimensional inequalities less tolerable. It's the old Albert Hirschman metaphor of the two lanes of traffic stuck in a tunnel. And if one starts moving, if you're in the other one, at first you feel good and hopeful because you think you're going to move soon. And if you don't, you start feeling very angry. And that's what's happened. The social explosions have been largely the work of these frustrated young generations. The third thing that has gone wrong is democratic politics, as it is now practiced in many Latin American countries. Not all of them, but many of them. Rightly or wrongly, in many countries, the political class is perceived to be corrupt. Political systems are failing to deliver reforms or effective public services. Much of the reason for this lies with three negative trends: populism, polarization, and fragmentation. Start with populism. Properly defined, as for example by Jan Werner Müller, this is neither of right nor left. It is not an ideology. It's a method of practicing politics, which has three essential elements. The first being a leader, who often claims to be a savior, and who always claims a special and direct bond with the second element, the people, in inverted commas. The people are not all citizens, but the people are only the authentic or true people whose contours the leader defines and excludes those who are not part of the true people. And the third part is that the leader evokes an enemy. The oligarchy, imperialism, or more recently the caste, as Javier Milei has borrowed from Italy's five-star movement via, interestingly, Podemos, a populist movement of the left. Although there were rural populist movements in both Russia and the United States in the 19th century, Latin America can claim to have invented modern urban populism, whose foremost early practitioners were Juan and Eva Perón in Argentina. Populism has revived in Latin America in this century. Not all the leftist leaders of what was known as the pink tide, in inverted commas, of the 2000s were populists, but some were. Hugo Chavez was a Latin American military caudillo and a disciple of Fidel Castro's communism, but he also had a strong populist streak, which was what made him effective and popular in Venezuela. Rafael Correa in Ecuador was a populist. So in contrasting ways are Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and now Gustavo Petro in Colombia. Historically, populism was one of the main routes by which the poor were included in Latin American political systems, in a region where late and incomplete industrialization meant that traditional class-based proletarian organization was relatively weak, although Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina were partial exceptions. But several features of populism tend to undermine and deinstitutionalize democracy. Because the leader claims a unique right to represent the people, populists are intolerant of checks and balances and independent institutions, such as judiciaries or electoral authorities. And just look what López Obrador has been trying to do. For example, what Bolsonaro tried to do, what Cristina Kirchner in Argentina has tried to do, which is undermine the judiciary in all three cases and the electoral authority in the first two cases. And because of the leader's need to define an enemy, populism tends to polarize. Just listen to López Obrador's morning news show in the Palacio Nacional, in which he routinely discredits political adversaries as enemies of the people. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, in some countries, there was a broad reformist political centre in Latin America that tended to involve or at least accept a technocratic approach to public policy. I recall a book about Latin America written by a former official in the Clinton administration in the US called Technopoles, which he thought was the trend of the future in Latin America. That species is largely extinct, and that explains why we have one distinguished technopole sitting next to us and not in the presidential palace in Santiago or in the Senate or whatever. But he is not alone, sadly. Often unfairly, technocrats no longer enjoy much credibility. Social media has ruthlessly contributed to simplify, polarize, and sometimes falsify the political debate in Latin America as elsewhere. The result has been the strengthening of extremes and the weakening of the centre. Take Colombia's presidential election last year. The centre was wiped out, and there was a runoff between Petro and Rodolfo Hernandez, an elderly and previously little-known mayor of the hard right. Centrist candidates withered in Brazil in the election last year. In Peru's runoff in 2021, Castillo won because his opponent was Keiko Fujimori, the polarizing daughter and heir to a conservative autocrat. Chile has seen, fortunately in minor key, a repetition of the polarization of 1970 to 1973. Gabriel Boric is the most left-wing figure to occupy the presidency since Salvador Allende, while his chief opponent, now, José Antonio Cast, is the most right-wing leader since Pinochet. Argentina's election this year should have seen an easy victory for the mainstream centre-right coalition, but in the event it came third, albeit narrowly, in the primaries, and the election is still open, but it doesn't look great for the centre-right. There has been much commentary about a second pink tide in Latin America. Certainly, 12 of its presidents, including those in all the larger countries, are at least nominally of the left, of various stripes of left. But the main political trend has been anti-incumbency, another manifestation of popular discontent. An opponent of some kind or other has won all but one of the last 17 elections in Latin America, the exception being Paraguay, where the Colorado Party is a unique political machine that has run the country with only a brief exception. This impulse of anti-incumbency brought those left-of-centre governments to office, but most of them are weak and lack a legislative majority. The anti-incumbent mood means that political cycles are short now in Latin America. A shift to the right has already begun, manifested in Chile and Argentina, as I've mentioned, and in Ecuador, Daniel Noboa of the centre-right looks set to defeat Correa's nominee in a runoff election in a fortnight's time. The security issue favours the right, and the left's flirtation with identity politics in some countries has produced a backlash. It's an uncomfortable truth that the right tends to do identity politics more effectively than the left. I think a big question in Latin America is what kind of right? Will it be the hard right, or does the centre right still have a chance in these pendulum swings? And the answer, of course, will vary from country to country. One reason for the relative weakness of many current governments is political fragmentation. Political parties, never particularly strong in most Latin American countries, have splintered in many of them. Many new parties are simply personal vehicles for ambitious and sometimes rich individuals. In Peru and Guatemala, for example, no party has elected a president more than once in the current democratic period. The design of electoral systems plays some role. Latin America is unusual in combining directly elected executive presidents with legislatures elected by proportional representation. Assembling a legislative majority is often hard as a result. Parties have also been weakened by the preferential vote in which each member of a party's slate campaigns individually, and so their rivals become their fellow candidates rather than the opposition. The result is a multiplication of parties. Take Chile. Following the introduction of more proportional representation a few years ago, 8 different coalitions or parties won seats in the legislature in the 2021 general election, compared with just 3 coalitions in 2010. Or take Peru, an extreme case. In the late 1980s, all but 3 of the 180 seats in the lower house of what was then a bicameral Congress were shared among 4 parties. Now, in a unicameral assembly of just 130 seats, there are 14 parties represented, and a further 17 representatives now belong to no party at all. It's a case of pathological political division. No? The challenge then facing Latin America, as in many parts of Europe, is thus to reinvent politics for the digital age, for the era of artificial intelligence, and for new generations, which inevitably requires new forms of organization and new forms of communication. The diagnosis is easy. The solution is hard, and it's going to be your generation. We have to hope that it's going to be your generation that cracks it. In short, Latin America is trapped in a vicious circle in which economic stagnation is prompting social frustration and the discredit of political systems, which in turn makes it harder for governments to achieve the structural reforms that might increase economic growth and reduce frustration. And there you complete the circle. The root of the problem and the potential solution, in my view, is political. Historically, this kind of political paralysis has tended to be resolved in Latin America through authoritarian interventions. Today, the region's armed forces have little appetite for ruling, at least directly. Some Brazilian generals and admirals, it seems, flirted with a coup at the start of the year, but most did not. Rather, the spectre haunting the region today is that of an elected civilian caudillo, such as Bukele in El Salvador, and he is the most popular, most talked about figure in the region today, which I think is deeply worrying. The challenge for Latin America's Democrats is to offer a better alternative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Wonderful. I find myself in a difficult position because I agree with 99% of what he said. So I will ask you the 1%, but I will also try to maybe get you to probe a little deeper on one of the 2 or 3 points. And I promise not to take up all the time so that students and colleagues in the room can also participate. But I cannot refrain from 2 or 3 questions. First one, and I'm going to take the issues more or less in the same order as you addressed them. You mentioned that there are a lot of, forgive my French, pissed off people in Latin America. And clearly, when people take to the street and burn buses, it's not typically because they're happy. So yes, there are people who are upset. But I find the narrative, the Economist is the happy exception to this rule, but the narrative of what I would call the New York Times approach to Latin America about why people are pissed off completely wrong, and I think you'll agree with me. The standard New York Times account says, well, Latin America became more unequal, and at some point inequality became so high that people took to the streets. As you pointed out, before the social explosion 5 years ago, inequality was going down in Latin America. To some extent because of good luck, the commodity boom, to some extent because of good policy, but inequality, if something is going down, it could not explain something that is going up, namely frustration and anger. The New York Times also wrote a piece saying that, in Chile people took to the streets because prices were increasing. In fact, on the same period, the New York Times reported that inflation was below the central bank's target, and the central bank was worrying about deflation, not inflation. So clearly the New York Times correspondent to Santiago had not done his or her homework. So if these things that are the standard explanations are clearly, barking up the wrong tree, in your view, I have my own views, but you're not interested in them. We have Michael to enlighten us tonight. Why is it that so many people are pissed off? Where are causes 1, 2, and 3 if we dispose of these wrong causes? What are the right ones?
Well, it's true that income inequality, measured income inequality, fell quite significantly in the first decade of the 21st century.
Indeed.
Coinciding with, in the region as a whole, coinciding with the commodity boom. And the commodity boom, of course, people who are against the extractive industries, which is another point, miss out that the commodity boom and extractive industries bring foreign exchange. And historically, Latin America has had a foreign exchange constraint. And foreign exchange gets recycled in higher imports, which allowed a bigger increase for unskilled labour, a big increase for unskilled labour in the region, which also helped to bring down income inequality. Of course, there's a debate about measurement and others, but I think it's pretty clear that that progress in the second decade of the 21st century in many countries either slowed or halted. So I think, we have to distinguish between Chile and other social explosions, such as Colombia or Ecuador or whatever, or Bolivia, Peru, whatever. And Brazil, remember in Brazil?
Brazil was the first one, actually.
Yeah, Brazil was the first one, yeah. Against the bus fare. Increase. And I think it's a lot to, as I tried to suggest, it's a lot to do with expectations, and it's generational. Who were the people in the streets? It wasn't people my age, it was people your age. And
it was middle class people mostly, not really the poor.
Yeah, varies a bit from country to country, but yes.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of reduced opportunity, the slowdown in economic growth in Chile was significant, right? And people felt that.
It's that the quality of ministers changed,
I'm not going to argue with that. And you've hit an important point, which is that people felt at the same time as they were doing less well than they expected to be doing, that other people were doing very well, thank you. And they included a political establishment which had kind of ossified, and some of its connections to the society had broken down. And they included business people who broke the rules. And Chile, the reformist governments in Chile repeatedly tightened the rules on corporate behavior and anti-monopoly and things like that. But it was all retrospective. And I often think that, well, I will mention his name. There's a guy called Eliodoro Mate.
Yes.
Mate, who is has the largest kind of paper products company in Latin America. If you go anywhere in Latin America and buy a packet of tissues, chances are it will be made by him. And he's a very rich man. And he pleaded guilty to cartel practices of price fixing with his main competitor, of raising the price. And he apologised and beat his breast and was fined, his company. But I think if he'd been put in jail, which he should be, in many advanced capitalist countries, he would be. I think that might have made Chileans feel better. So I think it was a combination of those factors.
Let me stay on this topic, which is very key. Take competition policy. Before we had competition policy, by definition we didn't have scandals because nobody knew of price fixing. There were 3 waves of legislation on competition policy in Chile. I was involved in the first one. So you legislate, it comes into being, you give the police powers to investigate, the police can now tap phones. Surprise, surprise, you get more of these scandals. That is social progress. Before you had nothing, now you have a policy, now you have enforcement, then maybe, the penal, the jail sentences came later. In fact, they came after that scandal, not before. So there was no jail sentence at the time, I think.
I think there would be no jail sentences, so that was my point. Because,
yeah.
Because the behaviour happened before the changes to the rules, which weren't retroactive. Correctly.
But the point I want to make is this. It's the old half-full, half-empty glass. When you have no such rules and no investigation, there are lots of scandals, but they're not scandals because nobody knows about them. You change the rules, you begin to investigate, surprise, surprise, they're, 2 a month, people are understandably really pissed off. The potential for memes when, you realize that people are fiddling with the price of toilet paper, it's, in fact, in Chile, the first big scandal was pharmacies. People realized that, the price of paracetamol was 3 times higher in Chile than it was in Argentina. So, glass half full says, we've moved, we've had a bunch of reforms, we have these things, now we're investigating. Glass half empty says, oh my God, these guys are terrible. Another example, education. It is true that in education in Chile, many of the new schools are of low quality. It is true that, for instance, some of the fees are very, very high, and it is true that some of the loans carry very high interest rates. That's the half-empty glass. It is also true that the number of university students in Chile went from 300,000 to 1.4 million. And that's an extraordinary gain, right? So the point that I'm trying to get at is the following. Could it not be that some of these types of discontent are in some sense associated with something which is progress, but in the process of that progress, things are revealed and things happen that very understandably cause people to be pissed off. But it is sort of a process that is headed in the right direction, not in the wrong direction. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's partly a problem of success, particularly in Chile, actually, to an extent in Colombia. There's another factor, which is a controversial factor, but in some cases there were organised groups behind these projects. They weren't just pissed off young people.
Indeed. A bit about which we know incredibly little.
In
right?
Chile.
Yes.
I think in Peru, Castillo, his political project was backed by Cuba, Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia. I mean, that's just a simple fact. And the protests, there are plenty of reasons for the protests. At one level, they were pissed off young people going out onto the streets, and people felt, rightly or wrongly, that Castillo was a symbol because he was of indigenous descent, and he was a poor guy, and if he was corrupt, well, we're a bit corrupt as well, maybe, and so there was this identification. But there was also this organised stuff by tens of thousands of illegal miners, for example. And his policy was to favour illegal miners over big mining, right? With disastrous environmental consequences. In Ecuador, Rafael Correa was one factor behind the protest. In Colombia, it was Petro, because it was, as you say in Spanish, agua para su molino. I mean, it was grist to their mill. Yeah? But yes, so I think they are complex, these phenomena, and a single explanation is not enough. There's always more than one thing. This tends to be true of many things.
This is a social science institution. We love complex, explanations. That's what we do for a living.
I'm glad somebody does it.
Not that we have any answers, but we ask very probing questions. Let me move you on to politics. You talked about the pink tide. You also hinted, and I agree, that the pink tide wasn't so pink and it wasn't really a tide. Or if it was a tide, it was sort of a short-lived tide. This one, the second one, exactly. And you also said toward the end that the real risk was not, the generals taking the tanks out of the regimiento and onto the streets. That's totally true. The real the real risk is the Bukele types. So might it not be that instead of fretting so much about a pink tide, we should be fretting about a brown tide? Brown as in brown shirts, which is tied, and I'm going to ask a two-part question here, to the extraordinary inability of government across a region to deal with organized crime. Again, the examples that I know best are from Chile, but Chile is a country without intelligence services. I mean, I can tell you, I can say it now, that when I was in Chile in government, we needed some special information, and we'd ask the intelligence services, and they would give us back results from Google. I mean, I could have done that. My RA could have done that, right? So, is there a scenario in which, in fact, the real failure is the state is weak, organized crime is less weak than the state, the population says, oh my God, streets were never that safe, but they're completely unsafe now. I used to be held up by a knife, I could deal with that, now I'm held up by guys wielding Uzis submachine guns, that's really scary. So, Bukele, where are you? That is a scenario which, at least to me, seems very, very, very frightening in more than one country. How likely is this in your book, and what would it look like if it does happen?
Yeah, let me start by saying, I don't think one should fret about the pink tide per se. One should fret about some of its leaders, but not about others. I mean, Latin America desperately needs a democratic, effective left. It would be a better place.
But as you pointed out, some are Democrats and some are populists, and some are authoritarian.
And populists, there's a distinction between populism and fascism, which in the literature has to do with fascists use violence and populists on the whole do not.
But it's rhetoric.
They use violent rhetoric.
Exactly.
Or can do. But there's an authoritarian streak in populism because of this definition that they are the only legitimate leaders. They like elections, but as long as they control them. So that's one element of
and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I will say Gabriel Boric is not a populist by that definition.
Not
I
at
did
all.
vote for the guy, but he's not a populist.
I think Boric,
and he's a Democrat.
And I've said it many times, he's a Democrat, and I've written it many times, he's a Democrat, and I think he arrived in office far too soon, sadly, for him and for Chile. I think he has a future. He's made lots of mistakes, he was always going to make lots of mistakes, because all governments make mistakes. And his group were young and inexperienced, and therefore they were going to make more mistakes, and they have. But they're not fatal mistakes, I think. And I think he does have a future, and he's a Democrat. And I would say Lula, with all his flaws, is not a populist. He's had populist movements, but he's not.
Although on Ukraine nowadays, he's talking rubbish.
Yeah, that's a different point. I
I know, but an important one.
You don't have to be a populist to talk rubbish on Ukraine. There's a sort of...
Fair enough.
There's a Venn diagram there. So your point was, should we worry about a brown tide? Absolutely, I think we should. And for me, that is the big worry in the region at the moment. It will vary from country to country, but Bukele is much talked about in Colombia, much talked about in Chile, much talked about in Peru. Milei is an interesting figure. He's more interesting than some of the coverage he's received, in the sense he comes from the kind of Menemist wing of Peronism, the pro-market wing of Peronism. He's an economist. I think his radical critique of the Kirchnerist, Pope Francis, clientelist industrial complex in Argentina is, to a large degree, right. I mean, his solution is exaggerated, but my worry about him, I think his solution to the economic problem is partly dollarization, but it's a bit hard to dollarize if your problem is you have no dollars, right? And so we'll see. Good luck to him on that. I suspect it won't happen. I think it would be a disaster if it did. We can talk about why. But the thing that really worries me about him is his authoritarian impulses on the security issue, on cultural issues, and so on. You know? And then in Brazil, I think the most likely, who knows? You know? I mean, it's a fool's game prediction, especially about the future, as somebody once said. But I think the most likely scenario at the end of Lula's term, depending on how he does, is probably the election of a right-wing president, but one who is not Bolsonarista, and one who is Bolsonarista, and one who is institutionalist. And in Mexico, we'll see. I mean, I think...
the polls are not looking very good for the opposition.
No, they're not. But I mean, you know, it's a long way off. I mean, it's 9 months or whatever. Yeah. I think, I don't know. Yeah, of course, Claudia Sheinbaum, or Sheinbaum, as they say in Mexico, is Andrés Manuel's candidate is the clear favorite because he remains popular despite everything, because he has a huge modern media machine, and the opposition parties are discredited and divided, or not terribly united. But I think Xochitl Galvez, the opposition candidate, who's emerged from nowhere in the past few weeks, I think she's interesting, and I think she has the chance of striking, resonating with Mexicans, and I have a sneaking feeling there might be a surprise, which doesn't mean there will be. I wouldn't rule it out, because people can respect Andrés Manuel, but actually think, well, we've had most of that. So we'll see.
My hunch is the same as yours.
Mm-hmm.
On the Mexican election.
Yeah, and
she's a fascinating character.
And organized crime in Mexico is a huge tool. I mean, it's whatever it is, 100 murders a day or more than 100 murders a day. Okay, it's a big country, but crime rate is still, there are large parts of the country which are not under government control. Andrés Manuel has 6 years, will have had 6 years to fix this, and he hasn't. It hasn't got better. It will be interesting to see what happens in the Mexico City mayoral election, where there's a police chief who's been quite effective, who worked for Sheinbaum, is running for the ruling party nomination back against Andrés Manuel. So we'll see. So this is not a ragtime of an answer. It's a real danger.
I absolutely think it is a very big danger. 2 more quick ones, and then we'll open it up. Politics. It used to be, is the economy stupid? I think you didn't phrase it this way, but your message is, it's the politics stupid.
Absolutely.
And it's not simply the politics as in this leader is good or that one is not. It's the politics as in the rules of the game are the wrong ones. You mentioned that Chile has 8 coalitions, that's right. It has 22 political parties in parliament. Brazil, and I looked this up the other day, has 44 legal political parties. Mm-hmm. They've all said you couldn't rule France because it had 200 kinds of cheese. You cannot run a country with 44 political parties, right? Now, the problem is the guys who set the rules, the constitutional framework, the electoral system that in fact enable this fragmentation to happen, are the guys who are in Congress today because of these rules. So we have the foxes in charge of the chickens, and understandably the foxes are not too keen on changing the rules of the game, and therefore constitutional reform proves very hard, as a number of countries have shown, including my own. What is, if any, the way out of this conundrum? You need some really serious rewriting of the political rules, and that's very hard to do.
Yeah, I would note in passing that Brazil has approved changes that will come into effect in future elections, which should reduce the number of parties represented in Congress by raising thresholds and by tweaking the rules about alliances. It is possible, but you're right. I mean, often the price of these fragmented legislatures is fiscal incontinence, because everybody wants a slice of the action, and that's,
and nobody internalizes the externalities, to use a little economic jargon.
Exactly, and that's the story of Brazil since 1988, and it's why Brazil has a serious structural growth problem. One of the other reasons.
I once heard Cardoso say in a small dinner, all of Brazil's problems date back to the Constitution, and in particular to this bit of the Constitution. When you have that many parties in Congress, two things happen. First of all, fiscal incontinence. Secondly, you rule by sending the guy with a suitcase full of cash. And, you know, that combination for Brazil, of course, has been absolutely useful.
I mean, I think, how do you fix it? I think there are only two possible ways. One is the authoritarian way, that somebody will come in and sweep all this stuff away, and then eventually they would write new rules. The other is the kind of patient work of consensus building and political pedagogy, which one still hopes might happen to you, actually.
If I were a believer, I'd be praying for it, but I'm an atheist, so I'm in a very bad place.
Well, yes, indeed. No, I'm not saying it will happen, but I think there's a chance it could happen. But it really comes down to how to reconnect politicians, experts, civil society, and the electorate, so that you can have these kind of debates. And that's a medium-term process. It won't happen quickly, but it has to start happening. And I see that as the only hope, actually. It's not easy, but, I think universities are terribly important, for example, as a point of intersection of those groups, and there are others. So it really is about political pedagogy.
Last question, and we'll open it up. And this is a juicier question, not a social science question. It's probably unfair, but you'll have some insight into this. It seems to me, I will speak as a citizen, that the quality of politicians in the region has gone down. Could be a factor of age, that I like the guys who I knew, and maybe I don't know the current one so well, but there was a generation of leaders at the time of the democratic transition who seemed sort of larger than life. Alfonsín was not a great president in terms of economic management, but he was larger than life. Lagos in Chile was pretty larger than life. Alan Garcia, who didn't end well, he was very much larger than life. I mean, he's very impressive. Salinas de Gortari in Mexico, probably a crook in some dimensions, but an extraordinarily intelligent man, and again, larger than life. You've interviewed these guys and these women, you've been in the same room as them. Are they sort of little people compared to the previous generation? Give me a little local color.
The quality of political leaders is declining. You started saying, I thought you were talking about this country.
Yes. Yeah, and the United States might be a good candidate for that too. Yes.
It's a global problem. But as with many global problems, Latin America tends to get an acute form.
Right.
I broadly agree. I think it's interesting. I would name Zedil in the group.
Absolutely.
I mean,
very competent people, exactly.
Who was, as Hans Magnus Ensen by the Ensensberger said, he was he described these figures called heroes of the retreat. And Zedil was the true hero of the retreat.
Very able president, absolutely.
I mean, I knew Salinas more because I lived in Mexico when he was in power. Very smart, but complicated man. Right? No, I think, I mean, the way I would choose to answer this problem, this question, is I think part of the problem is that the incentives are really wrong. And it is partly a global problem because the 24/7 news cycle and total transparency is completely punishing for political leaders. I mean, Churchill wouldn't have lasted, because he drank too much brandy, And
very early in the morning.
Throughout the day.
Yeah.
Firstly. Secondly, and this is more so in Latin America, if you're a good guy, you're likely to need an expensive lawyer when you leave office because you have had so many lawsuits against you from the bad guys, right? So it's an incentive to do anything else except go into politics. So, and that goes back.
Don't tell the young people in this room who I'm hoping will go into politics.
But that goes back to the failures of the judiciary. I think and there was a big anti-corruption movement in Latin America over the last 10 years, and it's largely failed. Bernardo Arevalo in Guatemala is a kind of an exception to the failure and a ray of hope, and because he comes from that movement, right? But there was judicial overreach and lack of proportion and politicization, in tackling corruption, which is discredited it. So it's important to try and get good people back into politics. I completely agree. And again, I think, the thing about politics, particularly in Latin America, you can actually really make a difference. I mean, one of the reasons I moved to Latin America in the first place was having visited it, because I just felt there was such a great sense of possibility. You can actually do things are not set in stone, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's for worse, but I mean, and therefore there is the chance. And I think this is strange from the question, but there is a deep strand of utopianism in Latin American political thought. In fact, if you read Utopia, Thomas More's book of that name, the island of Utopia, he doesn't give away exactly where it is, but he lets it be known it was off the Brazilian coast, which is perhaps not coincidental. But I think utopianism needs to give way to idealism, because utopianism is fine in many walks of life, but not in politics, because it leads to disasters and it leads to an attitude in which the imagined best, which is unachievable, becomes the enemy of the achievable good. And so utopianism needs to give way to idealism and commitment, but combined with the reality principle.
That's a perfect statement and a perfect moment to open up the questions. So you heard it here first, guys. Number one, go home because you can make a difference if you happen to be from Latin America. If you're not from Latin America, go home anyway, wherever home might be. After, of course, you get a degree from the LSE. And secondly, there may be room in the world for yet another generation of technocrats. Technocrats with less grey hair than we have here. But highly trained people can make a difference and do make a difference. And on the subject of drinking and politics, I just watched for a second time The Darkest Hour, the movie about Churchill during the Blitz. Unforgettable scene. He goes to have lunch with the king. And it's early in the day, and Churchill orders a whiskey, and the king says, "Mr. Churchill, how can you drink so early in the day?" And Churchill replies, "Practice, sir, practice." Not a bad line. All right, floor is open. Who's got first question? Professor Chang, right here.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating topic, but not going to actually allow me to sleep well at night unless I find something to compensate for that. So tell me, in your view, is there any positive case, a country that is going in the right direction, and why is it the case, and what can we learn about that country? I have my candidate, but I'll let you.
No, the positive case is always Uruguay. The tragedy is that Uruguay is 3.5 million people. in a region of 666 million people. But Uruguay is, one of the first countries, it's what Argentina ought to be, if they'd ever got its act together. One of the first welfare states in the world, one of the first countries to legalize divorce in the world, one of the first countries to abolish the death penalty in the world.
And to legalize marijuana.
And to legalize marijuana.
Very important.
It has political parties which still have managed to cohere and hang together, with 3 now rather than 2, and it has reasonably good government. It has problems, which including demographic problems, but and crime has increased as it has everywhere, and from time to time it gets hit by an Argentine gale from some Argentine disaster.
Or Brazil sometimes.
Occasionally Brazil, but less often. Argentina is better at doing hyperinflation.
Like Churchill, they have a lot of time.
Exactly. I mean, despite everything, and Andres may disagree, I still think watch Chile, just because I think the rule of law is deeper rooted in Chile. Because
I don't disagree with that at all, actually. No, I mean, that's why I said what I said about Boris. I think it's quite remarkable that, he could have gone many other ways, and he's been a scrupulous Democrat in ways that many other members of the Ties have not been.
Absolutely. Despite everything, I think there is a tradition of relative moderation in politics, which I think will come back. Peru, your country, I mean, it's a tragic case because it was doing very, very well in many ways. And I always remember that, it grew faster than Chile in the 21st century, reduced poverty faster than anywhere else in Latin America. The problem was always politics and institutions. And, I used to meet business people in Peru who told me, and I remember one saying, no, we have an Italian model here. The economy... Politics is a disaster, but it doesn't matter because the economy is fine, But that hasn't proved true in Italy either, but never mind. But, there's now a political meltdown in Peru, and what worries me really is that I don't see a lot of those perverse incentives about political careers are really acute in Peru, and I don't see much chance of that ending finding a way out democratically. So I do worry. I think Colombia is an interesting case because it has many strengths in many ways. I think Petro is a poor president with rather more severe consequences because armed groups are increasing again, and he will leave a degree of chaos. A lot depends on whether any reasonable political alternatives emerge. I think Mexico, if it had a different president, would be doing fantastically well. It would be raking in nearshoring, right? And it would have to tackle regional inequalities more. Andres Manuel is trying to do that, probably the wrong instruments, but we'll see. I actually think that Tren Maya, at least he's building it, unlike some other governments, building trains. But I think it may not be such a bad thing. We'll have to see. In 10 years' time.
The technocrats don't like it, but it may leave a lasting.
We'll see. But it needs a return to, well, let's say it needs better government. And Brazil. Argentina. I was quite optimistic about Argentina actually a few months ago. I've been rude about Argentina tonight, for which I apologise. But I thought there would be a pretty easy victory for the centre-right, and I thought the centre-right would have learned from the mistake of Macri's hubris. And Argentina needs to open its economy, and it needs to tackle the clientelist industrial complex. And the sequencing is a little bit complicated there, but it's not that complicated. And once you do that, Argentina will grow again,
Argentina has massive opportunities with lithium and with tech now.
And with vaca muerta.
The vaca muerta is no longer vaca, I mean, no longer muerta. It's the vaca.
The gases are rising in Buenos Aires as we speak. And it will be exploited as lithium and all the rest of it. But, you know, I think Milei will be a false turn if he wins.
He probably will.
And if Massa wins, that would be interesting, because Massa is a tacitly anti-Kirchnerist peronist. And, you know, I spoke to him, I went to see him last year, and in the Economist ministry, and it was interesting, because I thought if I close my eyes, I think I'm hearing a Menemist discourse here, which I haven't heard from a peronist for 20 years, you know. Brazil, well, we need a separate.
Well, panel 2. Yes. You said Uruguay had a demographic problem. I was reminded when I was in government in Chile, we had annual bilateral meetings of the cabinet. Uruguayan cabinet on one side of the table, Chilean cabinet on the other. It felt so good because we were so much younger than they were. It was amazing. Maria Cristina, you had a question.
Yes, 2 questions actually. First, everything seems to come down to institutions, right? Mm-hmm. So what was it during the democratization processes that was not able to develop sound institutions? I think it was the editor of La Prensa en El Salvador who said our institutions fell apart like paper at the minimum, you know, challenge. So what was it during those processes that didn't set Latin America to build institutions? And the second question would be, can you talk a bit about your opinion about what's going on in Guatemala?
No, I mean, the thing is that institutions do not grow out of a vacuum. You know, they are the products of history, of geography, of society, and of political history. You know? And even if you have perfect institutions on paper, you know, in the way they operate in practice may be very different from that. You know, and I think that, I mean, institutions are very important, but in a way that they're perfect. I mean, good institutions are in a way the kind of end state. I mean, they're where you get to if you do other things right. And I think, you know, I mean, countries with there's this wonderful phrase which is a total oxymoron, which is quite useful, by Arturo Valenzuela and Jonathan Hartland, if I remember rightly, 2 political scientists, and they talk about oligarchical democracies in Latin America, essentially between kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and in some cases the dictatorship period may end it. But those countries that had a kind of tradition of these oligarchical democracies, even if political constitution was restricted, they tend to have stronger institutions. So there's a certain kind of path dependency, which I think is absolute. I get very frustrated by the Robinson and Somerville argument that it all goes back to the colonial meter and so on. And frankly, I think it's wrong. And the fact and their argument that geography doesn't matter, I think is wrong as well. I think any Latin American knows that geography is fundamental. It's not the only factor, there are plenty of factors, but it's an important factor. So that was the first one. Remind me of Guatemala. Yeah, well, Guatemala. Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important moment for Latin America, and it's playing out in Guatemala because.
Well, Arevalo will be president.
I think an awful lot depends on the US in this case, and the US is playing a very big role in pressuring behind the scenes in the business community and the business community and so on. And I think he will be allowed to take office. I think the bit more difficult thing will be, can he govern effectively? Can he get a majority in Congress? Can he appoint a new Attorney General? Because this Attorney General is una bandida, you know? A bandit, you know? I'm on the record.
No una bandada, una bandida.
But I think it's terribly important.
Thank you. So in your case, you've spoken a couple of times about Petro, right? So Petro is an interesting candidate. It's a populist. It's very erratic, and he has a strange way. He's sort of started a new initiative to achieve peace, which he calls La Paz Total, right? And it's about engaging in dialogue with different groups that are even just common criminal groups, right? So Clan del Golfo, etc. Not only the ELA. And this seems to be an interesting way of trying to address the organized crime issue, right, that you mentioned earlier. Is it going to work?
I think it's interesting on paper, disastrous in practice.
Absolutely.
But, I think Petro is a complicated character. He published a memoir for the campaign, which lots of politicians do, and they're usually just totally boring. This is actually very interesting about him, because he keeps saying how intelligent he is, which tells you something about him, if he needs to say that. And secondly, about a third of the book is devoted to his years in the M19, which were formative for him. And the M19, he was not a guerrilla. He was a clandestine political operative on the M19. The M19 was a populist, nationalist, guerrilla equivalent. And he, within the M19, he was one who was pushing for political strategy, not a military strategy, and pushing for peace and so on. So he feels the cause of peace very personally. But he has a problem, which is that Santos made peace with the most important armed group in Colombia, right? Petro could have been a very good president, in my view, if he had simply decided to fully implement the 2016 peace agreement, which would have meant a tax reform to raise more revenue, investing more in health and education and security, particularly in rural areas, and doing land reform. And that would have been three things, and that's about all you can hope to achieve in a 4-year term. And there would have been three positives. Because he has this desperate need to impose his factual, historical, I mean, this is not just government, this is history that he's trying to make, right? He's trying to undo everything, including stuff that works. I think, the problem with Paz Total is that the only way you could do that, leave aside the ethical question of whether you can make peace without conditions with criminals, pure criminals, I mean, you have no political motive, is that the only way you can do it is at the same time if you have stick as well as carrot. And at the same time, he put in a defense minister who knows nothing about security, who is a man of integrity, but knows nothing about security, who fired 50 generals. The pressure on the illegal armed groups has eased, and they are growing. And so if he's lucky, he'll get an agreement with the ELA, mainly because their leaders are so elderly that they don't have much time.
They need a pension.
Yeah, they need a pension, exactly. But I don't think we'll be able to do more.
Vanessa.
Thank you, Michael, for such a great series of reflections. I want to ask you about an imagination exercise or something in relation to how would politics, how would democracy, how would the economy of Latin America would look like under a second mandate of Trump in the U.S. So,
You want us to end on a sour note?
Very good question. I'm more worried about the impact on Europe and the world and Ukraine. I think it's bad news for Latin America. It will be bad news for Mexico in particular. Because once again, U.S. policy since Trump has been towards Mexico and towards Latin America has been purely about migrants and fentanyl and nothing else. And I think it would be even more so. And I think it would be more aggression. It would be more diplomatic aggression. I would sincerely hope it would be no more than that. And for Latin America, I think it would help China, in Latin America if Trump was the second Trump term. And it would be a big mistake if the US tries to bully countries into cutting ties with China. I mean, you have to persuade countries to do that because they're sovereign countries and they do what's in their interest. And you have to persuade them that it's not in their interest. But Latin America would carry on, I think. So I think that the impact would be more marginal than in some other parts of the world, but negative.
I think one question from online.
We have a question from Jacqueline, who is a PhD student from political economy at the University of Coimbra. And she asks, usually the term populism is treated as a pejorative concept, and currently we talk about a reactionary, conservative and extremist populism. But is it possible that there is an emancipatory, progressive and politically moderate populism that can lead citizens and democracy on a path towards sustainable socio-economic development?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that there has been historically a positive side to populism in Latin America in terms of greater inclusion of people who were excluded. But I think there's a tension between populism and institution building and democracy that unfortunately is very strong. And populism, I mean, it's a separate discussion about the economics of populism, if you like, but I mean, populism has tended to be fiscally incontinent as well. Why? Because it's not really revolutionary, but it claims to be revolutionary. And so it pays for its promises through the fiscal deficit rather than by increasing taxes on the better off. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but its need to fulfill its promises is, just look at Argentina. I mean, that's the consequence of populism, the fact that Argentina has had so many decades of economic decline, in which Peronism, which is the quintessential populist movement, has been the dominant political force throughout that period. So, yes, I take the point that there is a positive element to it, but I'm afraid it's outweighed by the negative element.
You're too generous, Michael. The other day, to prepare for a talk, I looked up. If you've never read it, it's online. The letter that Perón sent Ibáñez in 1953, congratulating Ibáñez on his arrival in power in Chile. Perón, of course, was at the height of his powers. The letter is magnificent. At some point, it reads like this. He says, "Dear General, I'm so glad you reached power. Let me give you some advice. Give the people what they want. And when you think you're giving them too much, give them more." And then he says, "The Economist will try to frighten you with the idea of a financial collapse. Do not listen to them. The Economists go on and on about the economy for only one reason. They don't understand it." Perón had a good ear for prose. I mean, the letter is extraordinary. But I don't think that the real problem of populism is populism in the economic sense. Yes, Argentina is that, poster child for that. The problem with populism is that it is authoritarian. And people worry about Milei and dollarization. I don't worry about dollarization because it won't happen, because as you pointed out, to dollarize you need dollars. Argentina has no dollars. But I do worry about Milei because Milei is the kind of guy who could say, "Oh, they didn't pass my plan, fine. I close Congress." And you can imagine many people on the Plaza de Mayo saying, kick them all out, right? Yes. And it is that authoritarian streak in populism, right-wing populism and left-wing populism, that makes it a very, very tough game. Mm-hmm. So, our dear friend from Coimbra, Portugal, has read Chantal Mouffe, who says exactly that, and I think Chantal Mouffe is dead wrong. We have time for one more question. Yes, sir, over here.
Hi, my name is Andres. I'm from Mexico. I'm in the MPA program. And I guess the question is for both of you, because Professor Velasco, you raised a very important and interesting point about sort of like how, as we are increasing transparency, or not necessarily transparency, but as more things become visible in the age of social media, we're seeing a lot of things that maybe in terms of organized crime, in terms of corruption, etc., that maybe were going on since before, but we just didn't know that they were there. So my question is, like, are we maybe in, taking that line of thought, are we maybe in like an in-between period where we're still sort of like uncovering all these things, but maybe in the future as like, they become more public or transparency increases, will we maybe see like a decline in this sort of activity because of, the increase of visibility in so many senses of the word? I thought that concept was very interesting.
I have no idea what will come. I mean, I would separate your question into two bits. Is it the case that certain reforms are good in the long run, but politically tricky in the short run? Yes. I gave one example, but there are probably many others. In my mind, the paramount example is education. And let me be a boring economist for a minute. It doesn't have to do with transparency so much. When a country has very few professionals, the premium commanded by professionals in their wages over the rest of the population is very large. And that's one reason why Latin America is so unequal. It's not so much the billionaires that skew the income distribution, it's the people in this room, right? Who have a university degree and who make 10 times more than the person who doesn't. Now move from having 10 or 15% of each generation go to university to 45 or 50, which is the number today in Uruguay, and Costa Rica, and Argentina, and in Chile. What happens? That premium goes down. And suddenly you have a generation of people who went to university, who borrowed to go to university, who are in debt, and who expected to be part of that small elite, and they realize that, you lift a stone, and there's 5 psychologists and 2 lawyers. And the relative wage of psychologists and lawyers has gone down. So is it progress? Yes, of course it's progress. The income distribution is narrowing. There are more professionals. The society is better off. But you have one transitional generation who's very upset because they went to college on one set of expectations and they have faced something else once they graduated with lots of debt. So I think the general principle is right. Progress, progress in society is a little bit like, growing up as a human being. We go through something called adolescence. I have 3 teenage children, I can tell you, it's not easy. Now, that's the first half. The second half is what's the role of social media and transparency and 24/7 and all of that. I'm going to sound like an old professor here, but I only see bad repercussions of technology on politics. 25 years ago, we all thought that this would be the Arab Spring and the world would be happy because we would organize people to take to the streets in response to the bad oppressive dictators. Some of that happened. But the rest is terrible. Every single bit of it is terrible. I mean, I remember being in the Chilean parliament, and before legislators would vote, they would check their Twitter feed. And they would say, 5 tweets against this, I couldn't possibly vote for this bill. 5 tweets against it. That is not the way to run a country. And of course that's true. That's true there, it's also true here. It's true in the US, it's true everywhere. What you do about it, I have no idea.
Let me say that you touched on an important point. There's a difference between perception of crime and the reality of crime. Yeah? And I think social media and 24-hour news channels obviously highlight crime. But you just look at the objective numbers. I mean, we lived in Mexico City in the early 90s. And the pre-managed organized crime. Yeah, you're right, it existed, but the pre-managed it on the whole fairly effectively, in the sense that it kept its head down. And there were crimes, but I mean, Mexico was a much safer place then than it is now. And the same is true of many countries. I mean, the objective reality is there in the numbers of homicides, which tend to be fairly accurately reported on the whole. And you now have gun battles in the streets of suburbs of Santiago or in Rosario in Argentina, which you just didn't have before. So, but in general, I think you're right that part of maybe it's a 200-year-old lesson, maybe. But it's I think there is an issue of expectations and partly a problem of success that people are less poor than they were, they have higher expectations than they used to have, they want more, and that's a source of dissatisfaction, as we were saying earlier.
We are 5 minutes over time, and I think everybody in the room will agree with me that this has been fascinating, insightful, and fun. So please join me in a big round of applause.